Emergency?
Hello, I'm a short break foster carer for a child. He's not been able to be dropped off at his own house because his grandparents are not answering the door. I've just been round the back and I've seen his grandfather, and he appears to have a gun in his hand.
When this disturbing 999 call came in on a quiet Friday afternoon, no one could have predicted what investigators were about to uncover. Inside the house were two bodies and a sawn-off shotgun. But there were no signs of forced entry. At first, it looked like a tragic murder. But as the investigation unfolded, it became clear this was no ordinary case. The disturbing chain of events began just after 4:30 p.m. on Friday, July 6, 2012, when a respite minibus pulled up outside a modest semi-home on Clow Avenue in Sale, Greater Manchester. In the front seat, 17-year-old Daniel Seddon watched the driveway with bright anticipation. Most days, his grandfather Robert waited at the end of the path, while his grandmother Patricia watched from the front window. But that day, no one was there. His carer, Fergus, sensed something was wrong. He told Daniel to wait in the minibus and walked to the door. It was shut and, unusually, locked. The family car was still parked in the drive. Robert and Patricia never left the house when Daniel was due home. Fergus rang the bell, but no one came to open the door. He tapped on the living room window, but no one responded. Growing concerned, he walked around to the back of the house and looked through the patio doors. What he saw stopped him cold. Inside, Robert Seddon was slumped on the couch, a sawn-off shotgun resting across his lap. Alarmed, Fergus stepped back and immediately called 999. Within minutes, investigators arrived at the scene and forced their way into the house. Patricia was lying face down in the hallway, with a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Robert was sitting in the rear lounge with a gunshot wound to the neck. As the scene was cordoned off, police examined the house for clues. There was no sign of forced entry, and it did not appear as though a robbery had taken place. The doors and windows were intact and showed no signs of being tampered with. Inside, the house was undisturbed. Valuables, furniture, and personal belongings were all untouched.
The first impressions at the scene was that a murder had taken place, that being that Bob had shot his wife, Pat, and then shot himself.
But what the investigators didn't realize was that they were walking straight into a trap, because that's exactly what the killer wanted them to believe. As police made inquiries in the local area, neighbors described Robert and Patricia as a quiet, routine-driven couple. It was those very routines that first signaled something was wrong. Pat washed clothes every day, always in the same order. Whites were hung out first. Then, once they were dry, she replaced them with darks. On July 4th, neighbors saw her hang the whitewash in the morning. The dark load never followed. Robert was equally predictable. He never missed putting the bin out on Wednesday nights for Thursday collection. But on the night of July 4th, the bin stayed inside. From these small but telling details, investigators believed the couple had been dead for 2 days before their bodies were found. To narrow the timeline, detectives began reconstructing their movements in the hours before they died.
Extensive CCTV inquiries were then commenced, and one of these led to the recovery of footage on a local chippy where Bob could be seen at 12 on Wednesday the 4th of July, buying what we believe was probably his last meal, the fish and chips.
Analysis of the Seddons' home phone records from July 4th confirmed that 2 calls were answered, one from their son Stephen and another from social services shortly after 12:30 p.m., but the 4:21 p.m. call went unanswered. From this, detectives concluded that Robert and Patricia Seddon most likely died between 12:30 and 4:21 p.m. on July 4th. As inquiries continued, police built a clear picture of how Robert and Patricia had died. Ballistic experts established that both victims had been shot at close range with a sawn-off shotgun. They concluded it was impossible for Robert to have self-inflicted his neck wound. The shot had been fired from about 1.5 meters away, beyond the reach of his arms. The weapon's neat placement across his body was also inconsistent with
The way that he was sitting there holding the gun didn't make sense. Shotguns produce a lot of recoil when they are discharged. And if you invert a shotgun and point the muzzle to yourself, you haven't got any support for the recoil of the shotgun. It would fly across the room. So I was not expecting to see a sawn-off shotgun in the hands of a person who had shot himself. So that was a massive red flag for me.
Forensic analysis of the crime scene revealed another crucial detail.
We know that 2 shots had been discharged at the scene, but there was only one fired cartridge case. Where was the other cartridge case? The whole house was searched, upstairs, downstairs, even the workshop, and the other fire cartridge case was never found.
Whoever had carried out the killings had taken the cartridge with them when they left. These findings ruled out the possibility of a murder-suicide. Robert had not killed Patricia and then himself. Both had been deliberately executed. It was a double murder. With Robert ruled out as a suspect, police turned their attention to the family. Who would want Robert and Patricia dead, and why? Robert and Patricia Seddon had built a quiet, stable life in Sale, Greater Manchester. Married in 1966, they spent decades working hard and raising their family. Bob worked in ground maintenance for British Airways, while Pat kept the home and occasionally took cleaning jobs. They were modest, dependable, and deeply committed to one another. Neighbors described them as kind, mild-mannered, and modest. Bob and Pat's first child, Stephen, was born on August 31, 1966. A year later, in 1967, they welcomed their daughter, Leslie. In 1975, when Leslie was 7, she began suffering convulsions and was diagnosed with epilepsy.
That skewed the balance of the family quite radically. Suddenly, all the attention, both from Bob, the father, and Pat, the mother, was focused on Leslie.
She required a lot of care and support from her mum and dad. I think that Seddon really didn't like that because he felt that that detracted from him.
As Leslie's care needs grew, so did Stephen's resentment. He began to feel sidelined by his parents and started acting out. At home, he became difficult. Outside, he sought attention through rebellion. By the time he was a teenager, he'd become a known troublemaker.
Stephen felt that he wanted to get his father Bob's attention, and one way of getting it was to have the police turn up at the door or to get called to the police station. So we have the first of a string of brushes with the law as a juvenile. Every kind of bad boy behavior. He was up to anything.
The petty crimes escalated. And in 1989, Stephen was sentenced at Bolton Crown Court for obtaining goods by deception and theft. After his release, he made the decision to turn his life around and start a career in sales. Stephen had a natural gift for persuasion. Confident and well-dressed, he projected success and was skilled at making people believe in him. With a partner, he launched a company that promised small businesses access to European funding in exchange for a one-off fee of £300. In reality, no applications were ever made. Stephen and his partner simply pocketed the money. His sales skills were so impressive that more and more businesses fell for his scam. Within 2 years, the company was worth £5 million.
This enabled Seddon to enjoy this high-flying lifestyle. He drove a Bentley. He stayed at very expensive hotels. So that gave him a taste for the high life. And this is an individual who's always had a sense of entitlement, always felt like he deserves particular things in life.
For his parents, it seemed like a proud turnaround. Robert and Patricia believed their son had finally made something of himself. In 1996, he got married and moved to Durham with his wife, Nicola. For a while, it looked like things had settled. But the illusion didn't last. In 2000, a trading standards investigation exposed his company as a fraud. Stephen was convicted of deception and sentenced to a year in prison. Amid this turmoil, another tragedy struck his family. In 2008, Stephen's sister Leslie died in her sleep from a seizure at the age of 40. Her 12-year-old son, Daniel, who had severe learning difficulties, came under Bob and Pat's care. Despite their age and declining health, they took him in without hesitation and became his guardians. With the mental age of around 3, Daniel required full-time attention. To help them cope, a respite carer named Fergus would look after Daniel for a few days every week. The arrangement gave Bob and Pat some relief, but their days still revolved around Daniel's routine. Leslie's death also prompted a change in the will. With Stephen now their only surviving child, Robert and Patricia named him their sole heir in October of 2009. If both of them died, Stephen would inherit their estate, worth about £231,000 after debts, and assume guardianship of Daniel. For police, this inheritance was critical. It gave Stephen a clear financial motive. Friends and relatives described him as money-hungry, entitled, and constantly leaning on his parents for support. And in the years leading up to the murders, Robert and Patricia had already bailed him out more than once, releasing equity from their home to give him over £45,000, £22,500 towards a house deposit, and another £23,000 in cash. By 2012, Stephen was unemployed, heavily in debt, and down to just £5 in his bank account. For investigators, the picture was becoming clear. An inheritance from his parents would have solved his financial problems instantly. That background was fresh in detectives' minds when they visited him in Durham to break the news. As next of kin, he needed to be informed. On hearing what had happened, Stephen collapsed to the floor, moaning and sobbing. But when officers helped him up, his first words were not about his parents or nephew. Instead, he blurted out, "What am I going to do now? I'm going to lose the house. The mortgage is in my dad's name." The officers found the reaction as highly unusual. Stephen did not ask what happened, nor did he inquire about Daniel. For a man who had just been told both his parents had been killed, his concern for property and finances stood out starkly. Since Robert's GP was one of the last peoples to see him alive, investigators contacted the doctor to better understand his state of mind. The doctor confirmed Robert was being treated for depression, a condition triggered by the car accident 3 months earlier. But during his appointment on July 3rd, Robert also had voiced something far more troubling.
He went to see his local GP and he told his doctor that he'd become convinced that his son Stephen had attempted to kill them, had attempted to murder them all.
Robert had noticed numerous inconsistencies. Stephen had chosen an unusual isolated route and crashed at the only stretch without a barrier. He had escaped the sinking BMW with suspicious ease, while the rest of the family fought for their lives. But the most incriminating detail came when Robert discovered what was saved on Stephen's home television system.
He found at Seddon's house a saved video of how to escape a submerged vehicle, which was rather suspicious. So I think there was that realization that actually my son might be trying to kill me.
Armed with this new information, officers had to determine whether Robert's fears were the paranoid thoughts of a depressed man or a sign of something far more sinister. To find out, they re-examined the canal crash that had taken place just 3 months earlier. On March 20th, 2012, Stephen invited Robert, Patricia, and Daniel out for a belated Mother's Day meal at the Altrincham Golf Course restaurant, telling them it was his way of saying thank you for all they had done for him. Stephen had planned the outing with precision. He hired a BMW for the occasion and carried items he had no legitimate reason to bring: a crook lock and a sharp knife. The crook lock wasn't needed for that model of car, but it could be used to smash a window, ensuring his own escape. The knife was a backup to cut his seatbelt if required. Both tools were meant only for his survival. Instead of taking the shorter, direct route via Brooklands to the Altrincham Golf Course restaurant, he deliberately steered them onto the longer, more isolated canal road in Timperley. This choice was no accident. The road ran directly alongside the Bridgewater Canal, and crucially, it contained one exposed section with no crash barrier, the perfect place to stage a tragedy. When he reached the spot, Stephen suddenly complained of chest pains and began weaving the BMW erratically. Then, in a calculated move, he swerved the vehicle off the road and into the freezing canal waters.
Hello. Hi, I'm driving up Canal Road in Timperley in Manchester and a car has just driven into the canal.
Okay. Is anybody inside, can you tell?
Well, no one's out. They literally drove towards me and they sort of didn't stop and then they veered off and gone into the canal.
Panic erupted inside the car as Robert, Patricia, and Daniel struggled with their seatbelts. But Stephen was prepared. Instead of fighting, he calmly cut himself free and smashed the driver's window with the crook lock. Within seconds, he was outside, leaving the others trapped as the BMW began to sink. Witnesses told investigators that instead of helping, Stephen climbed onto the roof of the sinking car, his weight forcing it under more quickly. It was only when people on the towpath shouted at him to get down and help the others that he began smashing at the windows with his feet. First, he unbuckled Daniel and pushed him through the shattered window. With the help of the boys on the towpath, Daniel was pulled to safety. Stephen then returned for his father and safely brought him back to the bank too. Patricia, however, was still trapped in the back seat. The rising water pressure made it nearly impossible to force the door open, and she soon lost consciousness. Fortunately, onlookers on the towpath had already called for help, and emergency services quickly arrived. Firefighters smashed the rear window and pulled Patricia out just moments before the BMW slipped beneath the surface. On the bank, paramedics worked frantically for several minutes to get her breathing again before her heart restarted. Against all odds, she too survived. In the aftermath, Stephen embraced the spotlight. He posed for photographs with his parents and gave emotional interviews, claiming he had blacked out from sudden chest pains before the car swerved into the canal. But doctors later found no medical evidence of a cardiac event.
I went to the scene of the canal crash, and it was apparent that it was the only part of the road, the only stretch of the road where there wasn't a crash barrier at the side of the canal. But at the time, no one thought it was suspicious.
Further investigation into the canal crash showed that in the months leading up to it, Stephen had hired several cars, but never once added accidental damage insurance. The only exception was the BMW he drove into the Bridgewater Canal. It was the one vehicle he had specifically insured.
When you added together Bob's comments to his doctor about the suspicions in relation to the crash, Stephen's varying explanations about why the crash had happened, his heart condition that couldn't be detected, his added insurance on the car that was ultimately going to wind up in the canal, this all strongly pointed to the fact that Stephen had, in March that year, tried to kill his family by driving them into the canal.
With the evidence mounting, detectives decided it was time to bring Stephen in for questioning.
During Stephen's interviews, he gave us an awful lot of no-comment answers to an awful lot of questions. But one thing he was happy to talk about was his movements the week his mum and father had been murdered.
He told investigators that on July 2nd, he took his family to a caravan park in Fleetwood, a seaside town roughly 140 miles from their home in Seaham, on the night of July 3rd. He remembered he needed to sign on for a job seeker's allowance at the job center, so he left Fleetwood early the next morning to travel back. He was exhausted when he got home, so after a couple of cappuccinos, he decided to take a nap before his 10 a.m. appointment, but overslept. When he awoke, the power was out and the electric garage door trapped his car inside. He had no choice but to run to the job center, arriving late. Afterwards, he withdrew cash from a nearby ATM, went home for the afternoon, phoned his parents, and slept again. Later, when the power returned, he retrieved his car, went to a local shop for beer, and at around 6:30 p.m., visited a retail park with a family member. Then, in the evening, he drove back to Fleetwood, stopping for fuel and more beer along the way.
Seddon made a point of being visible on local CCTV in Seaham, so that gave him an alibi to say that he was in the northeast, obviously hundreds of miles away from Sale.
But that didn't stop investigators from scrutinizing his alibi. Every part of his story had to be verified. His timeline, his movements, even his excuses. If he was telling the truth, the evidence would support him. If not, the cracks would begin to show. Detectives reviewed CCTV footage and were able to verify some of his claims. Stephen was seen leaving the caravan park in Fleetwood at 5:24 a.m. on July 4th in his Volkswagen Passat. At 9:57 a.m., he signed in at the job center in Seaham. The staff there confirmed he had appeared out of breath when he arrived. By 10:36 a.m., cameras recorded him withdrawing cash from an ATM outside the Asda supermarket in Byron Place Shopping Center. The next confirmed sighting came at 4:36 p.m., when he was filmed buying beer at Home Bargains in the same shopping center. However, there were significant gaps in Stephen's movements that afternoon that could not be accounted for.
This meant that Stephen had an alibi from first thing in the morning, from going to the job centre and to the cash point to buy the Chinese beer in the afternoon and going to Fleetwood. What he didn't have was an alibi between the two times, which was around 11 and 4:30.
Since Robert and Patricia Seddon had been killed within this very window, Detectives needed solid evidence placing Stephen in sale at the time. Without it, he would walk free. After sifting through hours of CCTV, officers finally caught a breakthrough. On one camera outside the CM Job Center, a car pulled up and a figure stepped out. Moments later, on another camera, Stephen Seddon was recorded entering the building. What caught investigators' attention was what happened when he left. Stephen was seen walking toward the same car, and shortly afterwards, the vehicle drove away. If Stephen had been using that car that day, detectives needed to know which one it was. The job center footage was too poor to identify it, but luck was on their side. A bus passed by while Stephen was inside, and its onboard CCTV captured a much clearer image.
They're able to capture the footage that the bus had taken, and that's when they identify the car. It's a 3 Series blue BMW, and they make some further investigations and find out that a relative of Seddon's actually owns a 3 Series BMW. So now they have the number plate, they can start looking at the ANPR, the automatic number plate recognition data.
Detectives began scanning CCTV footage and ANPR systems across County Durham and Greater Manchester to track the movements of the blue BMW and place it near the Seddons' home.
If we couldn't place Stephen Seddon or the vehicle that Stephen Seddon had access to in the sale area at that time, our own inquiries would ultimately alibi him out as a suspect.
At 1:33 p.m., a blue BMW is spotted on Manor Road, close to Bob and Pat's home. At 1:59, the same vehicle was seen going away from the home. 4 minutes later, at 2:03, it was caught on camera passing Nisa Supermarket.
Then I got the phone call to say that the automated number plate recognition system had picked up a BMW that had gone from the northeast to the Greater Manchester area, and this was within our time frame of the killings.
Detectives also discovered that the car was registered to Stephen's brother-in-law. On the morning of July 4th, Stephen had stopped at his house and asked to borrow it to get to the job center. This was a pivotal moment. In interviews, Stephen had insisted he had no access to a car. Now, the police know he did, and the drive from CM to Sale would take about 2.5 hours, well within the time frame of the murders. Attention then turned to Stephen's phone records. On the morning of July 4th, he had called his parents' house. Investigators suspected the purpose was to confirm that they were home and learn about their plans for the day.
When we were investigating the phones, one of the things that really concerned me was the fact that his phone was in CM, and we've been able to establish that that phone had possibly been answered. This was an area that, when it went to court, he could use as a defence to say that my phone was in CM, it was answered, and I answered it.
Most of the calls and messages he received that day went unanswered, but one loan company call had been picked up. Because such calls were recorded, detectives recovered the audio and carried out a voice analysis.
Can I speak to Nick, please?
You'll have to phone back later.
Is he not available?
No.
All right, we'll give him a call later on then.
The voice that answered wasn't his. A comparison with another call Stephen had made days earlier confirmed the difference.
I'll speak to Nick.
Speaking.
Hi Nick, just a quick call. See if you're interested in going ahead with the loan application today.
Is this something that charges you money though before you get the loan?
We do charge a fee and guarantee you a loan.
Yeah, I've heard all that before. It's a scam. No, thanks.
Someone else had answered his phone while he was away, likely to create the illusion that he was still in CM. During later inquiries, the BMW Stephen was driving was picked up on CCTV heading toward a family member's home, where he reportedly left his mobile phone. Detectives believe that after the murders, Stephen went to a retail park in CM to meet the same relative and retrieve his phone. However, one major question remained. How had a sawn-off double-barreled shotgun ended up in Bob and Pat's home? Once again, Stephen's phone records offered a clue.
On the day of the murders, Stephen Seddon had made 2 telephone calls to a criminal associate in the northeast, a man who had previous convictions for firearms offences, and the gun that was used had actually been stolen in a burglary not far from Seddon's house in the northeast.
Detectives believe that Stephen collected the gun from his associate as he drove from CM to Sale. Detectives also learned that Stephen had recently met the landlady of the Mitchell Arms, a pub in County Durham, and told her he was interested in buying it.
The irony of this braggart, Stephen Seddon, pretending that he's got enough money to buy a pub in the northeast is remarkable, because when it was finally discovered how much he actually had in his bank account, it was £5.45. He was absolutely broke.
All the pieces of the puzzle were now in place. The CCTV footage, the shotgun, the ANPR hits, the phone data. Together, they told a clear story. Stephen had planned, staged, and executed the murders of his parents in pursuit of money. On July 12, 2012, Stephen Seddon was formally charged with the attempted murder of his parents in the canal crash and the murders of Bob and Patricia Seddon in their home. He pleaded not guilty, claiming that his presence near Sale on the day of the killings was because he was on a drug run close to his parents' house.
For both Robert and Pat, the final moments would have been one of just unimaginable horror that their beloved son had turned into such a cold-blooded killer and a monster.
This is really, really appalling. You know, the people who give you life, the people who support you and give you their last penny, that you are prepared to so ruthlessly execute them for your own greed really is despicable.
The trial began at Manchester Crown Court on February 20th, 2013. After a 35-day hearing and 18 hours of jury deliberation, Stephen Seddon was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 40 years.
This is akin to a whole life sentence for someone of Seddon's age. He's very unlikely to ever get released from prison, and I think this is a sentence which is wholly deserved.
During sentencing, Mr. Justice Hamblin called Stephen Seddon's actions truly evil, driven not by anger or provocation, but by greed alone.